Most of us have had a weird neighbor at some point. But there's a difference between weird and dangerous, and I didn't figure that out until it was almost too late. My wife and I moved into our house in Clarksville, Tennessee in the spring of 2019. Small neighborhood, quiet street, the kind of place where people wave at you from their driveways. We were coming from an apartment in Nashville, so the space felt like a dream. Backyard, garage, a porch with actual room to sit. We were done with city noise. We wanted calm. For the first 2 weeks, everything was exactly that. Then we met Dennis. He lived directly across the street, mid-50s, always in the same gray jacket no matter the temperature. He introduced himself the evening we were unloading groceries, shook my hand too long, smiled too wide, and told us he'd lived on the block for 11 years. Said he knew everything about this street. He said it like it was a brag. My wife whispered to me after he walked away, "Something is off with that guy." I told her he was probably just lonely. I wish I'd taken her seriously then. The small things started within the first month. We'd come home to find our trash cans moved. Not knocked over, moved. Repositioned neatly against the side of the house in a way we never left them. I figured it was the wind at first. Then it happened on a day with no wind at all. I mentioned it to my wife and we both let it go. That was a mistake. Dennis started showing up in places that were hard to explain. I'd be pulling into the driveway after work and he'd be right there at the end of his own driveway, facing our house. No phone in his hand, nothing, just standing. I'd wave. He'd wave back. Normal enough on the surface, but it happened too often. 3, 4 times a week. Always right as I pulled in, like the timing wasn't a coincidence. One Saturday morning, I went outside to grab the mail and found him standing at the edge of my property. Not on the sidewalk, on my lawn. When I asked him what he was doing, he said he'd noticed a crack in our driveway and wanted to let me know. He pointed to a hairline crack near the garage, the kind every driveway in America has. I thanked him and went back inside. My wife saw the whole thing from the window and she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. We started locking the gate to the backyard. Then in July, something happened that shifted everything. My wife came home on a Tuesday afternoon and found a cardboard box sitting on our front step. No label, no return address, nothing. Just a box sealed with tape. She brought it inside and called me at work. I told her not to open it, that I'd be home in an hour. When I got there, we opened it together. Inside was a smoke detector, brand new, still in the packaging, and a handwritten note on a torn piece of paper that said, "Yours stopped working." I could hear it beeping from across the street. "Stay safe." I walked through the entire house that night checking every smoke detector. Every single one was working perfectly. Not one was beeping. Not one was low on battery. There was nothing wrong with any of them, so he was lying. And whatever the reason was, it wasn't concern for our safety. My wife wanted to call the police. I talked her out of it. I told her what would they even do? A man left a smoke detector on our porch. I replay that conversation in my head a lot, because I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, we started finding small things disturbed around the outside of the house. A lawn chair moved to a different angle. The welcome mat flipped upside down. The small potted plant on the porch step shifted 2 feet to the left. Each one alone meant nothing. Together they meant someone was coming onto our property when we weren't home and touching our things. I put a camera on the front porch. 4 days later, I had footage. 2:17 in the morning. Dennis walks across the street in the dark, comes up our driveway, and crouches down next to our front door for almost 4 minutes. I couldn't tell exactly what he was doing from the angle, but his hands were moving near the base of the door frame. Then he stood up, walked back across the street, and went inside his house like he'd just stepped out for air. I called the police the next morning. 2 officers came out, took a report, reviewed the footage on my phone. They went across the street and knocked on Dennis's door. He answered in that same gray jacket and apparently told them he'd been sleepwalking since childhood and had no memory of the incident. They came back to my house and explained that without evidence of an actual crime, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to document everything and call again if it escalated. I want to pause here and just tell you, if you ever get advice like that, please push harder than I did. Because what happened next forced the situation into the open in the worst way possible. The following Friday night, my wife and I were both home. It was around 9 o'clock. She was in the kitchen and I was in the living room when she called out to me, voice low and tight, the kind of tone that tells you not to say anything loud. I walked into the kitchen and she pointed toward the window above the sink. The backyard gate, the one we'd been locking for months, was standing wide open. I called 911 immediately, told them someone had entered our locked backyard and we didn't know if they were still back there. They sent a car out within minutes. Officers searched the yard, the side of the house, the area around the garage. Nothing. But on the back exterior wall of the house near the dryer vent, they found fresh tool marks, the kind left by something being wedged into a small space and pried. An officer told us quietly that it looked like someone had been attempting to access the interior through that vent casing. Dennis was arrested 2 days later. It came out during the investigation that he had a history, a different name, a different state, a prior conviction involving another family whose home he'd fixated on for months before entering it while they slept. He'd served time, changed his name after his release, moved to Clarksville. We were not his first. We moved out of that house within 6 weeks. We haven't gone back. I think about that note with the smoke detector sometimes. That casual, friendly handwriting. Stay safe. I moved into my house in Boise, Idaho about 3 years ago. Small, quiet neighborhood. The kind of street where people wave from their driveways and leave holiday decorations up a week too long. Nothing dramatic, nothing exciting. That was the whole point. I'd just come out of a rough couple of years and I wanted boring. I wanted peaceful. For the first few weeks, everything was exactly that. My neighbor to the left was a woman named Carol. Late 60s, retired, grew tomatoes in her front yard, said good morning every single time she saw me. My neighbor to the right was a man I didn't see much. The house had been empty when I moved in, and then one day there was a car in the driveway and lights on inside. I figured someone had moved in. I didn't think anything of it. His name was Glenn. I know that now. But back then he introduced himself as Ray. He came over maybe a week after I first noticed him, knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening, handed me a small bag of apples, and said he'd gotten too many from his sister's tree and didn't want them to go to waste. He seemed perfectly normal, friendly, even, somewhere in his 40s, average height. We talked on the porch for maybe 10 minutes. He asked what I did for work, whether I liked the neighborhood, whether I had family nearby. Normal neighbor small talk. I told him I worked remotely, that the neighborhood seemed nice, that my closest family was a few hours away. I thought nothing of it. The first thing that bothered me was small. About 2 weeks after that conversation, I was working from my kitchen table and I glanced out the window. Ray was standing at the edge of his driveway looking directly at my house, not moving, just standing. I watched him for a second, figured maybe he was just zoning out, and went back to my work. When I looked up again a few minutes later, he was gone. It happened again a few days later. Same spot, same stillness. But this time when I looked up, he turned and walked back inside like he'd been caught. I mentioned it to Carol. She got quiet in a way I didn't expect. She told me she didn't know much about him, that he'd moved in fast and kept to himself mostly, but that she'd noticed he seemed to keep odd hours. Said she'd seen lights on over there at 3, 4 in the morning. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Some people are night owls. Some people space out in their driveways. Then my mail started getting tampered with. It was subtle at first. Envelopes that looked like they'd been opened and resealed. A package that arrived dented in a way that suggested it had been opened from the bottom. I couldn't prove anything. My mailbox was at the end of the driveway, shared with nobody, and there were no cameras on that end of my property. But I knew what I was looking at. I installed a camera covering the mailbox in the front of my house. Nothing happened for about a week. And then one night, around 11:30, the camera picked up Ray walking down his driveway, stopping in front of my mailbox and just standing there. He didn't open it. He didn't touch it. He just stood in front of it for a minute and a half and then walked back, like he knew the camera was there. I called the non-emergency police line and told them what was going on. They were polite. They said unless he was actually taking something or trespassing, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to document everything. So I did. And what I found when I started paying closer attention was worse than I expected. I pulled my public records out of habit one night just to see what was out there about me. My address was listed, obviously. My name. But there was also a listing on a neighborhood data site that had my work schedule roughly mapped out based on my social media posts. I'd been posting things without thinking. A morning coffee photo, a caption about wrapping up work for the day, a comment on a neighborhood group about being home all week. Taken together, anyone paying attention would know exactly when I was home and when I wasn't. Someone had been paying attention. I deleted everything and made my accounts private. That same week, I asked Carol if she'd be willing to tell me if she ever saw Ray near my property. She agreed without hesitating, which told me she'd been thinking about him too. 3 days later, she texted me, said Ray had been in my backyard. I wasn't home. I was at the grocery store 20 minutes away. She said she'd seen him come around the side of my house, try the back gate, and then stand in the yard for a few minutes before leaving. I drove home shaking. I called the police this time, not the non-emergency line. An officer came out and took a report. They went and knocked on Ray's door. He answered, calm as anything, said he thought he'd seen a stray dog go through my gate and was just checking. The officer couldn't do much more than issue a verbal warning. But when they ran his name, his real name, which they found through the vehicle registration, Glenn Ray Holloway, that was enough for me. I didn't sleep in that house for the next 3 weeks. Stayed with a friend while I sorted things out. The police did increase patrols on my street during that time. And a neighbor 2 blocks over who had outdoor cameras caught Glenn loading up his car in the middle of the night about 9 days after everything came to a head. He was gone before morning. No forwarding address. Just gone. I still live in that house. I put up a proper camera system, got to know my neighbors better, stopped posting anything about my schedule online. But here's what stays with me, the part I can't shake. When police spoke to Glenn that day, they asked him why he'd been watching my house. He smiled and said he was just being a good neighbor. Wanted to make sure I was okay living there alone. He knew I lived alone. I had never told him that. Most people never question the person living right next to them. You wave. Maybe you say good morning. And then you go inside and lock your door, assuming the person 12 feet away from you is just a normal human being living a normal life. I used to think that way too. Until the summer I moved into a duplex in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and realized the man on the other side of my wall was one of the most disturbing people I have ever encountered in my life. I moved in during June. It was hot, the kind of sticky Louisiana heat that makes you feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. I was 26, starting a new job, and the place was cheap and close to work. That was all I needed. The landlord told me the other unit had a long-term tenant named Dale, said he'd been there for almost 7 years. Quiet guy, he told me, keeps to himself. I thought nothing of it. The first time I saw Dale, he was standing on his small porch, just standing there, arms at his sides, staring out at the parking lot. Not at his phone, not drinking coffee, just standing completely still. It was 6 in the morning. I figured maybe he was just a weird early riser. I waved. He didn't wave back. He turned his head slowly and looked at me and then looked away. That was it. I told myself some people are just awkward. I went to work and forgot about it. The first real thing that got under my skin happened about 3 weeks in. I came home late one evening, around 9:30, And as I walked up the shared driveway, I noticed something on my doorstep. A plastic grocery bag tied at the top, sitting right in front of my door. I looked around. Nobody there. I opened the bag and inside were 4 cans of soup. Chicken noodle. No note. No explanation, just soup. I assumed it was Dale, maybe trying to be neighborly in the most awkward way possible. I knocked on his door to say thank you. He opened it about 4 inches, looked at me and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Then he closed the door. I stood there for a second, confused, checked with the landlord the next day. He had no idea who left it. I threw the soup away. After that, I started paying more attention to Dale. I couldn't help it. Something about him felt off in a way I couldn't explain. He never had visitors. Never. In the months I lived there, not a single person came to his door. He had a car, an older tan sedan, and he would leave every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 2 in the afternoon and come back 90 minutes later. Every single time. I started noticing the pattern without meaning to. One Friday night in August, I had a couple friends over. Nothing loud, just dinner. Around 10 o'clock, someone knocked on the shared interior wall between our units. Not a bang, a knock, slow and deliberate, 3 times. My friend Marcus looked at me and raised his eyebrows. I knocked back once, kind of as a joke. There was a long pause, then 3 more knocks, exactly the same as before. We all went quiet. Nobody knocked again that night, but the mood was gone. My friends left early. The next morning I ran into Dale at the mailboxes. I asked him directly if he had knocked on the wall the night before. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "I was just saying hello." I said, "You could have just texted me." He said, "I don't have your number." I said, "Then how were you going to say hello?" He didn't answer. He took his mail and walked inside. I called my landlord that afternoon and started asking questions about Dale. Who was he? What did he do? How did he end up here for 7 years? The landlord was vague at first, but then told me something. He said that 2 years before I moved in, a previous tenant had filed a complaint against Dale. Said he had found personal information about her printed out and slipped under her door. Her full name, her place of work, the make and model of her car. The landlord said Dale claimed he found the paper and was just returning it to her. The woman moved out within the week. The landlord told me it was a misunderstanding and that Dale had never caused any other problems. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the next 2 weeks, I started finding small things out of place. A welcome mat I had moved to a different position, moved back. Small things. Things that if I told someone about, they would say I was being paranoid. But I knew my space. I knew where I put things. Then one evening I came home to find my spare key was missing. I kept it under the mat, which I know is a bad habit, but I had been doing it for months. It was just gone. I tore my porch apart looking for it. Nothing. I told myself maybe I had knocked it loose without realizing it. But I had a locksmith come the next morning anyway, and I changed my locks. When the locksmith was leaving, Dale opened his front door and watched us. Just watched, didn't say anything. The locksmith glanced at me and said quietly, "That your neighbor?" I said yes. He said, "He was watching us the whole time I was here." I said I knew. I started the process of breaking my lease that same week. The landlord pushed back, wanted fees, wanted documentation of why I needed to leave. I told him everything. The soup, the wall knocking, the information complaint about the previous tenant, the key. He went quiet on the phone for a long time and then told me he would waive the fees. I was out within 30 days. What still gets to me, even now, is that Dale never did anything I could take to the police. Nothing was ever provable. Nothing crossed a legal line in a way that was clear enough to act on. He was just always there, always watching, always a little too aware of everything I did, every pattern I had, every habit I kept. And the thing is, I drive past that neighborhood sometimes. The duplex is still there, and I always wonder about whoever moved into my old unit. I wonder if they wave at Dale in the morning. I wonder if they think he's just a quiet, awkward guy who keeps to himself. I used to think that too. That's all 3 stories for today. And if even one of them made you think twice about the people around you, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't yet and press the bell so you won't miss what's coming next. And drop a comment below, tell me which of the 3 stories got to you the most. I read every single one. Stay alert out there. Stay safe. I'll see you in the next one.